Bootstrap Confidential, the podcast where we talk to successful bootstrappers about the playbook for bootstrapping.
Welcome to Bootstrap Confidential, where this episode I'm delighted to welcome multiple founder and now strategic advisor, Piers Bearne, who's going to talk about the number of businesses he's bootstrapped, he's founded, he's invested in, and all the lessons he's learned over the last 30 plus years in the media and events world. Piers, thanks very much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Charles. Great to be here.
I always like to start with, what was the tipping moment when you went from the corporate background into launching your own business? And it's interesting. I've spoken, I think, to 4 founders, successful founders in the media and event space, and they all, like you, started at Terrapin. So whether they're intending to or not, Terrapin are providing like a sort of training ground for successful founders to leave their stable and go and spread their wings. But firstly, what was the moment when you decided to take the leap, and what was your thinking there? And then maybe we can talk about what are Terrapin doing, good or bad, that's creating this sort of deluge of successful founders to exit them.
Well, I think the first clue is in the use of the word corporate. I mean, certainly when I worked there, Terrapin was not very corporate. And actually, the other great training ground for events entrepreneurs is what was UKI Media. I started by Tony Robinson, which spawned Smarter Shows, which spawned Elite Exhibitions, which has now spawned more entrepreneurs who were employees who became partners of the previous founder. And I think what Tony's got in common with the third one is Euromoney, which is now Delinian. All of those had 2 characteristics. One of them is high degree of autonomy for highly competitive people in the organization linked to uncapped commissions. So I remember when James Reader, who founded Smarter Shows and used to work at UKI, when UKI was sold, there was a whole conversation about how's this guy earning so much compared to us who are a big corporate. I think it was UBM at the time. And generally speaking, that sort of thing attracts a certain kind of person, but also gives them a moment in their career where they go, oh, hold on a second, if I'm getting 5% of that, and I multiply it by 20, what would I need to do to get the other 95% of it? So it creates a lot of energy in the organization, but it also means that some of the best people will go and remain friends. I'm friends with Greg Hitchin, my former boss. He was a bit unhappy when I left, as you might be, but that's one thing, is you get a taste of money. I mean, in particular, there was also a shareholding aspect to it. So we had a shadow equity scheme, and I made this calculation of, well, this is only ever going to work if Terrapin is sold. And by the way, that was in 2002. It's 2026. The company hasn't been sold. It's worth a great deal more now, so they're right to hold it. I just thought, what would I need to do to replace my equity value in my income? So those kind of letting younger people into those conversations sort of opens up that window in some of their minds. The second thing that happened is about the finite nature of human life. So I turned 30 and I went, well, I'm working for someone else, and I kind of hate working for other people. I hadn't admitted it to myself because I'd been successful. I'd been promoted. I got good profit shares. I was in the confidence of the C-suite. But I'm like, well, how long will this go on for? When soon I'm going to be paid too much that I actually won't want to leave. I won't want to take the risk of my mortgage and all that kind of thing. So I have to do it now or never kind of thing. I feel differently about entrepreneurship now. And I certainly work with a lot of founders who don't have those motivations of, I have to do this now or I'll sort of die, or, I have to replace the value of my equity, because there are great entrepreneurs who haven't really had equity, they just had profit share. But for me, that's what made it happen. Now, having done it a couple of times with Collingwood, and we'll come back to this, what's motivated me is curiosity. And what I think is the true sign of entrepreneurship is curiosity. And I would say when people found, they come from 2 points. One of them is, I'm trying to replace my job and just survive and not have to work for somebody. That's sort of a 0.5. And then you've got an entrepreneur who's got the confidence and the curiosity. They've got an idea, there's a problem that needs to be solved, and they don't worry about the logistical side of it. Now, it took me a few goes to not worry about the logistical side of it. I suffer from anxiety and, I don't come from a rich family. But now I'm like, I look for people who've got that sense of excitement and curiosity. And most of Collingwood's clients look like that. They don't look how I looked when I started my first business.
It's so interesting on 2 of the things you said there, curiosity. I think every founder I speak to, and you ask them, what is the number one trait you're looking for when you're bringing people on, especially at the start when you really can't afford to pay people what they're worth? What's the number one trait you're looking for? And every single answer is the same. It's always curiosity. And it's also interesting what you say about your very honest confessions. You hate working for other people. Because again, lots of founders I talk to will come up with lots of reasons about, it was this time in life. I saw an opportunity here. There were all these motivations here. I wanted to, and then fundamentally they go, at the end of the day, I just hate being told what to do. I wanted to work for myself. And I can speak like yourself as someone who suffered from that. I think my first business was very much I just have to replace my income and not be told what to do. And then by the second and third one, you're starting to bring that curiosity into play a bit more. But talking about the leaving Terrapin and going off to found Rockstar Media, was it a very specific? So some people leave and they're like, as you say, I just want to go and do something for myself. They're highly competitive. They like being autonomous. They're not quite sure what it is. They kind of poke around in corners with a few clients before they eventually arrive on, okay, this is how this is going to grow. And other people are like, no, I had a very, very specific idea and plan of I'm going to do this and this is what it's going to take. So were you, which one of those were you? Or were you somewhere between the two? Certainly with Rockstar, your first kind of
It
stuff.
was purely like, I have to leave. I've got a bonus coming in. I went to the cash point to check the bonus. I phoned my boss because he was in Australia. And then I was like, right, I've written down a one-line business plan for my first show. And at that time, my idea was do 4 shows in 4 sectors because that was kind of the Terrapin model, see which one works. My first one worked really well. My second idea wasn't as good. And I just sort of half gave it, half sold it to the sales guy. And then my whole idea about events shifted. And to Terrapin's credit, they're no longer a factory that works in lots and lots of different sectors. They do a small number of big events in a fewer sectors. But I went through this learning of I have run teams of people who produce events in any old sector, and we just try and optimize the metrics around it, the performance metrics, to, oh, I'm a player in this emerging Wi-Fi sector, which is characterized by some VC funded, some bootstrap businesses. And you develop these friendships and people rely on you. And the people in the corporates involved in the sector are kind of on the maverick end. And so I formed an advisory board and I had all this informal advice from exhibitors. And I had to learn about how to run rebooks and had to learn how to sell. Like I'd never sold a bean before. And of course, that's the easiest bit of it because it is your business selling it. Just like, I've got this great idea. I've done all this stuff for it. Do you want to buy it? And they're like, do you rest your house on it? Yeah, great. I'll sign. And much later, I realized all the other stuff that I thought I knew as an MD of a regional business at Terrapin and actually wasn't deeply in my soul because I was so young when I learned it, like about how to run a P&L, how to create strategy, how to create value. And just fast forwarding a little bit, nothing gives you a better critique of the value you create in your first business than selling it and then being asked to do some work on buy-side M&A for corporate, looking at companies like yours and go, oh, right, that's what you value. Oh, right, that was a waste of time. And those conversations going from sell side to buy side really quickly just gave me this sort of burning, this might take a long time, but I have to get this right. And so I think it's something we are getting right at Collingwood on our own journey, and we'll come back to that. But also it's kind of, I've been asked by so many entrepreneurs to just help them informally. And I thought, no, we could, sort of went poacher, gamekeeper, let's run an international poaching ring. That would be fun. Poaching being, of course, the art of taking money from corporates and private equity and transferring it to individuals who have creative ambitions for the world.
And you mentioned there, obviously lots of people who haven't got a sales background are initially nervous about selling, but then as you say, it's your idea, it's your baby. If you're not going to be passionate and able to communicate, then no one else will. But there are so many areas when you start a business where you think you've kind of got a working knowledge because you've been working in a bigger organization and there's a team around you and you've totally failed to appreciate what all these other people do. And then
Yeah.
suddenly you're like, okay, how do I drive a P&L? How do I create a strategy? How do I document all these things that you didn't realize you didn't know and you thought you did? You suddenly realize, actually, I don't know anything about this. I'm really up against it now. So when you were doing that, I mean, mentors are obviously always important. You said you had advisory boards, but did you kind of like generally self-teach, or did you go, you know what, there's a couple of areas here. I don't know if it's a chief products officer or a CFO where I need to get enough money to get a specialist in as quickly as possible because this is not an area I want to be self-teaching in.
I think with Rock Media, I didn't. So I was just like, I was a bit burned out. I enjoyed working at home, and I wanted to sell quickly, so I didn't want to have the expense and risk of staff. So how I learned was by using relatively expensive senior freelancers to do the delivery on the shows. So I learned from them. I think, ironically, for somebody who owns a corporate finance business, learning how a great finance function works has been the longest, deepest journey. And we've got a great CFO at Collingwood, and I'm learning a ton from him. And he's worked in 9-figure private equity-backed businesses, so there's a lot of gravitas and a lot of, but also he understands how small businesses should work. So he's integrated them. So that's been the longest journey. I think there's a sort of business mentorship thing, and I don't know any entrepreneur who doesn't have other exited or more senior entrepreneurs who's helped them. My friend Keith Parker, who sold his server maintenance business a few years back, just really helpful. From the first time of me pitching for funding, he just listened to the pitch and said one or two things. He actually put in money into some of my subsequent businesses where I was kind of the investor, director, chair type person. And he's just got the art of saying a pithy thing, which might be just very commercial, or it might be very strategic. The other person who's had a huge influence since I started going on my own is Simon Kimball, he was the CEO of Clarion when I was working there. He's now got various chair roles, both in sort of charity and in private equity-backed businesses, including he's now the chair of a business that I co-founded and was previously chair of, and invested in that business when we sold to PE. And he's just got this incredible, from low tactical, this is how you get a show to scale, to very high strategic financial value creation planning, playing with the capital structure of a business stuff. So, maybe we'll have a conversation once a year, but he'll drop some gem in that just dissipates across my consciousness. And I try and turn bits of it into a template for our clients. So those are probably the two biggest influences. But I think you're like this as well, that the more diversity you've got in the people you take advice from, including corporate people, public sector people, the better you become as a brain and an operator, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's true in many ways. As I found, the more diversity of experiences you get, both advising and within the business, is all good, all to the good for fueling growth. So you mentioned there that you use senior freelancers initially at Rockstar, and you spoke about curiosity being a key trait, and obviously you've been involved in a number of businesses now. So when you're a founder, and perhaps your first startup, and you're looking to start building a team, and as we know, you're asking people to come on board, generally, particularly if you're bootstrapping, for a lot less money than they get anywhere else, for a lot longer hours than they get anywhere else, with like a lot more risk and potentially a lot less reward if it doesn't pan out. So what are the types of character traits other than curiosity, or what are the types of personalities that you look for at a start when you're trying to build a team as a founder with your startup?
I guess there's probably two sets of answers. So, that's because there were three sections in my entrepreneur career. So Rock Media was subscale, used freelancers, wanted to get a business away, wanted to get a show away, wanted to understand how this whole thing worked. Then this sort of hybrid role with me as a co-founder, chair, investor, director. I worked with co-founders who the CEOs had significant shareholding in the business, didn't put capital into it. And actually, I didn't ask them to make a salary sacrifice. I asked them to make an intentional sacrifice because I was going to be teaching them how to be entrepreneurs. And in neither case had they been running P&Ls at bigger companies. So their earnings would come through dividends and through capital gain. And then they would have a sort of typical startup team around them. But again, my view was get people to take a sacrifice on their package, but don't on the basic, especially if you live in London, because let's say somebody's got share options over 1, 2, 3, 4% of the business. That doesn't mean anything to them at that point. You've got control of the exit. They don't. You can fire them. They can't fire you. You want them to be hungry so that they can make a really big commission. But you can't really play that game unless somebody is either very experienced or they're kind of 5, 10% plus shareholders in the business. So I divide the people into those two categories. And I think that's something I still think about, to be really clear. There's people who get their only incentive is a bonus or a commission. There are people who've got a blend of that and some equity, and they sort of understand the value of the equity, and you don't want them focused on an exit. And then you've got the people who are in with you. They've put money in, they've put salary sacrifice. They're thinking, I call it the Sunday morning group. Who's thinking about the business on a Sunday morning? And you can't have that many people in that group.
Yeah, otherwise you're going to have too many cooks spoil the broth and all of that, and too much paralytical decision making.
You also can't divide 100% into that many 10% plus
Yes, exactly.
without cutting your own
There's the maths,
share too
there's
much.
the maths element as well. Okay, so you've got all these different sort of personalities and different types and everything. So I want to talk about culture, because culture is something I think is so important. I mean, I think it should be important in every business. I had a huge amount of experience in the corporate world, so I can't comment on that. But certainly in the startup founder world, culture is really what can drive a business to punch way above its weight and have much more success. And I know at Collingwood, which I'll come on to in a bit, you've got a very unique culture, but how how instrumental were you in determining this is the culture that I want for perhaps not for the subscale rockstar media, but for Collingwood initially. This is the kind of culture I want, and these are the things I'm going to do to make sure that we adhere to that culture. And this is kind of like the brand and the values and how we're represented. And how much did you just let it grow organically?
Very intentional. I think one of the first business books I read had the deepest effect, which is Built to Last, which you'll have read, and the importance of values. And I think people sometimes conflate values and culture. They're not quite the same thing. But if you're not aligned on the values with the people that you hire, certainly the first people that you hire, your culture is going to be corrupt or wrong, or it's going to eject you. And that's not great. Secondly, I think, why wouldn't you create a place that you'd want to work in, but the people who aren't like you want to work in? And that was an issue for Collingwood because we started in the teeth of the pandemic. So, and at that point, I would say, honestly, I was less aware of diversity than how the hell am I going to get this thing away? So who started it? Four white blokes who come from media and are all quite good at business development, just working like dogs and working out what the hell this thing was. And we had to, and it's still a work in progress, diversify our thought, diversify our teams, and actually bring in people who've come from different cultures and who will have an influence on the culture. And this is another thing you have to accept. Your culture comes out of your values and it comes out of your founders. But then if you don't allow it to morph to match the people that you need to have to deliver on the value and the mission that you're promising to your customers, you're going to stultify it, or you're going to create conflict, or you're going to create some form of corruption in the organization. So there's a lot of work. Daniel Pitchford, my business partner, who's the CEO, and his team spend a lot of time doing offsites and thinking about how do our values match into stuff. We use values for recruitment. We recognize our values on a monthly basis, and the people who've incarnated them as values champions, we put that much higher than a salesperson of the month or whatever. So to me, it's super, super important. I think the element that's in culture that's different from values is about commercial behaviors, habits, and intentions. And so the culture when we started out kind of reflects me, which is let's just do whatever the hell we can to do something great. Let's make people amazingly happy. And I knew at some point someone's going to have to tidy this up and turn it into a high margin business. And that's what's happened. It's been deeply painful for Daniel and his team over the last 3 years, because you're not just doing all the hard work on the KPIs. You're also going, look, we can't just make those promises anymore. We can't just work with that small company anymore who take loads of management time. We need to have discipline, and we need to be really clear with our clients about what they get and what they don't get. We don't charge on a day rate basis. That's included in our cost model. We charge on an outcomes basis. And, well, not quite outcomes, but the value of the retainer is fixed and it's related to the outcomes. And so we have to be really disciplined about resources that we put in. Where I come from, events and media, you don't care about the resources because it's really the cost of putting the thing on, the number of people who come that matters. In professional services, it's the unit of time that matters. So everyone has to measure their time. That's really countercultural if you're from the commercial end of events. So those of us who've come from that industry rather than from consulting, and we've got more people who've come from consulting and corporate finance now, we struggle with it. And more of the company is run by people who've come from a professional services or corporate finance background. And so the cultures move towards those two ethoses.
Much more towards that. Yeah, it's interesting what you say, because when you go from startup to scale up, like, obviously as a founder, all you're thinking about how exciting this journey is going to be. We're growing, we're growing, we're growing. But it comes down to those very, very awkward conversations where you've had some very small client that you've been massively over delivering on because they were one of the first clients you've ever had. and you love working for them, and and they just get this amazing, amazing service off you, and then someone comes in, generally like a business development or a CFO person from a more structured background, and goes, you are literally losing money on that client. You've got to turn around to them and say, I can't do this for you anymore. And as a founder, it's awful. It's like, thank you so much for supporting us for our first 4 years of growth. I'm afraid we can't do that anymore. So there's a lots of problems with scaling, which want to talk about really. So as you start to as you start to scale up, and the impact it has on your culture, as you're saying. So as you start to scale up, how do you manage both those impacts on your culture, the impacts on your clients, some of whom, you're going to have to fundamentally change the value proposition, how you charge for it, and they might suddenly either have to pay more or not be able to afford it. The way that the team interacts. What are some of the, aside from all the excitement of scaling up, what are some of the things that founders should be really, beware of as they go through as they start to go through the process?
Yeah, well, there's probably a few aphorisms we use. I mean, one of them is you have to be aware that your startup strengths are your scale up weaknesses. So you'll often have heard this talking to an early stage entrepreneur, we're so agile. Well, of course you're agile. There's 5 of you. You'll have to be less agile if you want there to be 50 of you and you want to make 2 million EBITDA or 3 million EBITDA. There's no way around it. And more specifically, the founder strengths can become the company's weakness. Like I can come up with a new idea, and I know you can, the back of drop of a hat, and we can implement it in 3 months. But if we do that all the time, we'll never scale.
Yeah.
And so in handing over the CEO role to Daniel, I was very strict on the rules. No one even questioned the rules that I proposed for this new relationship, because I was put myself in such a small set of boxes in terms of what I do, so that I can't create chaos in the organization. No one else can create chaos because we've got good governance, we've got a board structure, and we practice what we preach to our clients. But that thing, so startup strengths becoming scale up weaknesses, that's a blind spot for people. Implication of that, and we've been through this, but a first-time entrepreneur, it's always painful. You're going to churn 80 to 100% of your startup team, maybe including yourself from your role as CEO. To get to 5 million, it'll be 80%. To get to 10 million, it'll be 90 or 100. The third thing is, I started this business because I love being an entrepreneur. I love working for myself. So we have fun. Yeah, good. Go down the pub, have fun, or go out, do away days, have fun. If you are successful, will end up creating a corporate structure, then eventually gets absorbed into or acquires stuff and becomes more corporate. There is an orthodoxy about 20 million plus businesses. There's only one way you can really run them. There's only one way you can really attract the talent of people who can take them to 50 or 100 million. You can still mess around a bit at 10 million, but then you tend to bump up against that limitation. So if you want to be successful, you're going to create something that you don't want to work in unless you change. That, to me, that's really the biggest. Oh, we don't want to do that. We don't want to have a board meeting. Well, how are you going to make a decision about this launch you're doing it to America in a way that gets you the 20 million EV that you want to change your life and your family's life? And
Yeah, it's one of the most painful things you can do as an entrepreneur, because nobody warns you that fundamentally, when you move from this size to this to that size, all the things that you love that get you out of bed in the morning, that get you charging into the office, that getting you firing the team up, and it's the same team you've had since like the get-go, are going to change, including the team and the people that you've known through this journey. And as you say, you can either become much more orthodox and fundamentally change your behaviors, or you can step back and go, you know what, this is not for me. Once, we got to sort of just about around 25 million before I went, in order to get to the next stage, we need people who are genuinely interested in the things that I have absolutely no time for. And therefore, I need to get out of here, because I am fundamentally the biggest blocker to our growth. Every time we do something that you should be doing in order to scale, I'm there, as you say, causing chaos in the middle, going, no, no, forget that. That's all boring. Let's go off and do this fun, crazy little thing over here. And because the cultures are so often founder-led, everyone's like, yeah, that's a much more fun idea, even though it's nothing about what the plan was, the board meeting was, etc., etc. At board meetings where it was embarrassing, when I was going, well, we did this, and the board was going, but you weren't supposed to do that. You didn't tell us. Like, it's a huge, huge transition. So sorry,
I'll tell you, I'm a hypocrite, because in not being an exec in the business, I'm now the non-exec who says, I don't believe that was in our top 5 for the year, or I don't think we should do that thing for that little client. Why are we wasting money on that community thing? which I started, right? So I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect, but because I'm not an exec, I've got a separation between my job and my role as a shareholder. And so as a director, I can be more objective about that stuff. When you're in it and you're not just with the customers, but you're with the teams, you're emotionally bought into making things nice for people, making things nice for customers and teams. And I've become quite an arsehole in the last year or so. And I work as an non-executive.
I wouldn't be so harsh on yourself as that. I've done exactly the same thing. The difference between being at a board meeting where you're the CEO and you're reporting to the board and you're thinking, God, they're being so unreasonable. Like, why are you calling, and then suddenly you come back into the board as just a non-exec, non-exec, but a shareholder. And in, like you say, you're like, well, hang on a second. Last board meeting, you said this. Now you're saying this. What's happened there? Like, explain yourself. And like, you have a complete distance and objectivity that you simply can't have when you're part of the executive team, which is, as you say, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as see, but it's slightly alarming. Like you kind of look at yourself in the mirror, go, "Oh wow, look at what you've become." So yeah, it is a big difference.
I've become one of the people that I relied on to make me more sensible at work when I was in the exec position. And I also, an example of this will be restructures. So the first time I had to do restructure as a co-founder, chair, investor in a business, it just made my personality collapse. I was like, I'm shameful. It's wrong. We've got everything wrong. And then you run it and you're like, oh, we got rid of all the mediocre people. We focused on our best products. We've kept people who are now happier because they're not having to share the wealth with people who are a bit crapper. We've got a lower cost base, so we're not worrying about cash flow. And we've now this new idea starting to come through about how we can improve things. And so, I'm a really big fan of, not fan is the wrong word, but regular restructures in organizations to bring an honesty to the cost base, but also an honesty to the culture. It's linked to project mania as well. And you get this in quite big companies. You say, well, what's on your plate? And you get this matrix of, there are 9 pillars and there's, 7 priorities in each. There are 63 work items. Which of those are the important ones? And Collingwood, we use this thing of top, it's the Vern Harmish top 5.
Scaling up, like, yeah.
If you max it, if the board and the shareholders can't care more about 5 things that go to value in any one year, it becomes very easy, as you were saying earlier, to go, does what we're doing fit in one of these 5? And if it doesn't, and it's not easy to do within our BAU, we are going to stop it. And so using those top 5 and the OKRs associated with them and a regular rhythm of quarterly check-ins on the OKRs just seems to cut all this distraction and cost out of an organization.
Yeah.
I love distraction, right? I'm a creative person. I love new ideas, but I also love not having to implement the bastards,
Yeah, that's one of the big differences is, and one of the most galling things I found, having railed against this new orthodoxy that was being imposed, was then to step onto the other side of the fence and realize actually it worked because suddenly all the numbers suddenly started improving. As you say, the cost base is under control, the margins increasing, revenues going up. When you're like, all the numbers I've been fighting to try and get move my own particular way without getting anywhere, suddenly all started working after the orthodoxy was implemented. I want to come back to scaling up and how Collingwood helps businesses that are looking to that in a minute. But just coming back to being a founder, so you said you mentioned earlier that when you were at Rockstar Media, you were at one point completely and utterly exhausted, which touches on a really important point because I think every founder I speak to says the same thing. When you say what surprised you the most when you first started, it's the stress, the stress, the exhaustion, the mental resilience you need, the self-motivation. Like everyone thinks that they're resilient, everyone thinks that they can cope with a huge amount of stress, and then you start your own business. And I had a lady who's got an app in the UK that was a trained sports psychologist who advised professional sports teams on how to cope with resilience. And she was like, so I knew resilience inside out. I've got this. And then she started and she went, I totally don't have this at all. I was not expecting this. So when you started, how did you find that? Did it catch you by surprise? Were you aware of it? How did you cope with it?
Okay, well, I think there are 2 different answers to that. And in a way, my experience at Collingwood is almost the opposite to my experience at Rock Media, because Rock Media, it's me just trying to escape from being an employee, and Collingwood, there's something highly intentional about it based on another 20 years experience. So, with Rock Media, it forced me to face my shadow side and all the dark stuff in my soul. And actually, there was a point where I went on a trip to Tanzania and took the wrong kind of malaria medication, had induced kind of depression and anxiety, and realized that I had a whole lot of stuff that I had to work out that wasn't just to do with the drug. And so that was really the journey, was just to get through that and try and become a better version of myself and to have a better life, and also to be a better husband and, you know, son and all the rest of it. I think with Collingwood, I had an intention. It just got exaggerated by what happened in the world. So my intention was, Rebecca and I were going to move to Cornwall, where we live now. And, you know, I go to London several times a year for client and board meetings. I do a lot of my work remotely. And I brought in a team around me who would be in our office in London more often. And it's, you know, any one day, there might be 2/3 of our employees in there. So it is an office-based culture. And I'm just going to work really hard for 3 years. You know, we'd bought a house, spent way too much money renovating it, and I wanted to be able to fund that and a new kind of life for us. And I thought, well, I'm going to need something else. Plus, I've got this idea. I've been doing all this stuff informally as me and gradually using freelancers to deliver the growth advisory and corporate finance advisory that we do. But I want to make it into a growth business. And I said to Rebecca, my wife, it's going to be 3 years of really hard work. Like, it's going to be hard. And then COVID hit. So it was straight from, you know, freelancers and me doing a lot of the work, to already having hired people, brought in equity partners, to it's 70 hours a week. My pension's gone, you know, my income's gone, my clients' pensions have gone, my clients' incomes have gone, and we just got to keep going. Just got to borrow what we can, trade through, use our deal fees to fund stuff, eat baked beans, whatever we've got to do. This has to work. But also, what we saw was what we were doing, people really needed it in a downturn. And I didn't know that when I started scaling it. And in seeing how people responded to what we're delivering, I was more passionate, and so were the team and my partners around me, to make this thing work. But there's a very high price to pay for that. In my case, you know, when I get into that, I can't get out of workaholism. And so I was going through a sort of regular crash of kind of depression and all this sort of stuff. I do things around it, you know, yoga, I go surfing, I do sport. But if you've worked a 14-hour day, you're not going to do yoga at the end of it. You're not going to get up another half hour earlier and do a meditation at the beginning. You're just going to get through the day, you know, watch Gardener's World and fall asleep at 8:30 and start again at 5 the next morning. And so I don't know that there's a way around that if you're a founder of a business, but it's about when you, in those first 2 years, when you are doing the 70 hours, if you can't visualize that year 3 starts to look like a normal, hardworking person, and year 4, you've got the potential to do less, you are going to kill yourself and other people or the business.
Yeah.
So I'm relatively sensitive and creative person. There are other founders who aren't. But what happens is, if they push through it, then they drag other people into it, their employees, their family members. You know, you often see like just illness or uncomfortable things affecting people around those kind of founders, because they're sort of draining the energy out of the universe.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's any more functional than doing it to yourself, quite frankly. So accept that there's going to be the pain, but have a drop dead date on it, by which time you've delegated it or you've stopped in some way. Is my advice.
Yeah, I mean that leads me on to my next question, actually, because one of the things that that I, you know, like yourself, I work with probably at the smaller end, like, you know, startups that are just getting going, is bootstrapping and everything, and obviously lots of them are, you know, they've been going for 6 months or 12 months and they've got their runway, and then, you know, this is the point when I stop. But possibly because the kind of like the media myths that have been created in part by Hollywood, you know, Steve Jobs being the most famous one, of like, you know, you stop, you get kicked out, you come back, you go again, you go again, you go again, and eventually, you know, there are all these media stories about who someone, you know, or even Sir James Dyson, like 25 years of, like, you know, rebuilding wheelbarrows and hoovers before he got there. And so people don't stop when they should. They just double down again and again and again. And you're talking to them, they're like, I mortgaged my house, then I remortgaged my house, and now this, and, you know, my wife's like this, and my kids are like this, or my partner's like this. And, you know, you're looking and going, you should have stopped quite some time ago, which has created this thing called founder tourism, which is, you know, a phrase that's sort of bouncing around at the moment, which is a combination of that, and it's also a combination of that, I guess, the kind of like the YouTube app Gen Z thing, where lots of people now, like, you know, they look at Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or any of the probably more younger, more famous entrepreneurs, and they're like, okay, I want to go straight from school and I want to do that, or I want to stop what I'm doing and I want to do that, and they think I'm just going to do this and it's going to be really easy, and within a year I'll sell it for $1 billion and it's all going to be fun, it's going to be fantastic, and I'll post about it on various social media and it's going to be an amazing journey. And then they start trying to be a founder and they haven't done as you said. They haven't said, for the next 2 years, my life is going to be incredibly difficult and miserable and hard and really, really challenging, and I need to accept that in advance. So, whilst I think as a society we should be encouraging founders and the creativity that founders bring and the benefits it brings to an economy, at the same time you don't want to encourage people into foolhardy enterprises. So how do we get the balance of like saying, look, this is a great and incredible thing you can do starting a business, but buyer beware?
I think we have to recognize there are different kinds of people and personalities involved in it. So it's not just the motivation for doing it, it's also what's the shape of your brain. I'm a relatively open-minded and calm listening person. I often get assigned to work with people who are somewhere on the ADHD spectrum or the autism spectrum, right? And how those people approach things. I mean, the stuff they do well, you go, oh my God, that would have taken me 6 months. You just banged it out overnight. You just saw the whole pattern of the thing. But they struggle with some of the other aspects and also with balancing their lives. In general terms, in my experience, I'm not trying to categorize people on the spectrum like that. Then you've got people who are coming at it because they can't stop being the engineer, right? They just really want to do the thing, working with the client, designing the thing. And so they have to find people around them to eventually run the company. There's those different levels of creativity, different ways that the brain works. And then there's a special category of people. I mean, I think you and I probably know a lot of people who've made millions or tens of millions or low hundreds of millions. And quite a lot of them are nice people whom you would have in your house and go for a meal with or whatever. When somebody bootstraps their way to 10 figures, there's often something a little bit special driving them, a sort of a lower empathy for people. You have to see people as small units to want to have thousands of them doing your bidding. You may, if you look at what creates success in the tech markets, as well as in the big resource extraction companies, it is not about following compliance or creating a great culture. It's about spotting something you can break and put back and disintermediate lots of other people. That's not something I can ever imagine myself doing any more than I can imagine myself being somebody who sends people to war, even though I accept that it's important there are people in the world who make those decisions. So somebody who wants to be a founder and make $1 billion, if they're not somewhat sociopathic and lacking in empathy and possibly narcissistic, why are we promising them they should do it? Like, have a go, get a few million of turnover, see if you like it, decide whether you want to go to the next stage, meet some people who are in corporates if you haven't worked there already, understand whether you want to build a corporate organization, but find out. Of course, the other thing is we're finding out who we are through the process of being entrepreneurs. And a 17-year-old goes, I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to run this big organization. Well, you're going to go through 5 really major inflections of you learning who you are as a person. Massive one happens when you're 21, massive one happens when you're 28. Weird shit happens when you're 50. You don't know what kind of person you're going to want to be or how you're going to organize your life. And I think there should be a lot more nuanced conversations about it. I totally agree with what you said, this whole Instagram crapola of, I'm an amazing entrepreneur, or look at my product, or aren't I handsome, or, I said handsome because, of course, it's mostly men doing this stuff. Why can't we let people go on a journey and help them to discover that stuff? And discover what kind of entrepreneur they are, not just what kind of company they're going to have.
You mentioned men there. I'm not going to go. I often, with some of my female guests, talk about the fact that 98% of VC funding goes to white men, and what that means for society as a whole. And one of the things I find interesting is when I speak to successful female entrepreneurs, some of whom have had, like, a few of the ones I've had on the show have had like multiple 8-figure exits, like 3 or 4 8-figure exits, and they're our age. They're incredibly successful. And apologies for generalizing here on a gender basis, but you're saying really love to talk to you and hear your story, and they often say, oh, do you think it's interesting? And I'm not sure, I'm not sure anyone else would like to listen to this. And it's just like I don't have that problem with male entrepreneurs. everyone's obviously slightly reticent, but yeah, it's just an interesting difference. But we've talked a lot about.
Well, I think so. There's some things here about opportunity. There's something about gender. There's also stuff here about economic class and social class.
Yeah.
You talk about confidence. You get confidence by being educated into it from the beginning, or you're a very special person who's been taught not to have confidence and you've overcome that. And so that's where the percentages come from.
Yeah.
I think what it creates is something highly objectionable, which is, Elon Musk, he merits his wealth. Well, first of all, he inherited some. And secondly, he had a lot of help along the way that people from different backgrounds didn't get. And thirdly, you probably can intuit my view on what kind of personality he is.
Well, his father owned an emerald mine in South Africa during apartheid, which was both helpful and speaks to some ethical issues about where the wealth came from. Yeah, before we disappear down like a social analysis, we'll keep us here for a long time. So just going. Okay, so you can go back to, let's say, 2000, 2002. And you can go back in time, sit down with your former self, 25 years less experience, and go, okay, just before you start this journey, maybe with Rockstar Media, know this one thing. This is one thing that I really wish I'd known when I was about to start Rockstar Media, that I've learned over the last 25 years, which if I could tell my previous self would be a fantastic thing for any founder to know and to be cognizant of as they kind of start this journey. What would be the one thing you would tell your younger self that you think would help them have a perhaps not less necessarily a smoother or more enjoyable, but a slightly less challenging journey to where you are?
So, from a company point of view, make everything about value. So understand what, if you were to exit the business or to get investment in the business, what good would look like, what KPIs you'd be working on, what sort of mission you'd have, the clarity around market headroom, the kind of sector that you'd be in if it's B2B. And that will help to inform every decision that you make. So start with the end in mind. From a personal point of view, it's almost the opposite. It's enter the journey with curiosity and the willingness to look yourself in the mirror, to deal with your shadow side. If you are in a co-founder relationship, to deal with the shadows in your relationship. And in working through that, you will create a great company, and great companies create great businesses and great assets. So I think it's those two. And we actually look, Collingwood works with the company side, right? We're appointed by the board, we work on value creation, but a lot of the words that we use in our one-to-ones with our founder clients are about the personal journey. Like, what about your limitations? What about your strengths? What about the people you're going to bring around you? What about the culture you're creating? What about that person who left? Why does it feel so hard? Why am I working so hard? How do I talk to my partner about it? We listen, because you can't separate the two, but they are different.
Yeah. And curiosity, as you say, and as I said throughout, is such a key part, both in the business and in looking in the mirror and being curious about yourself and who you are and how you're going to transform as part of the journey. And Piers, I'm really sorry we're out of time. I could carry on talking for hours on this subject. It's been fascinating. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks for doing the show.
For all our listeners, if you'd like to hear more podcasts on how to bootstrap, or if you want to access all our bootstrapping resources and playbooks, then just go to our website, www.bootstrapconfidential.com, for free registration.